One of the things that should be checked is that you have proper clearance underneath the doors. In order to check that, by putting down a piece of underlayment and a piece of the floor that's going to be installed, you can open your doors and check to see that there is enough clearance. As you can see with this door here, it will not have to be undercut, and it is at the right height. One of the characteristics of a floating floor system is the fact that there will be an expansion gap around the perimeter of the room. We have to decide how we are going to cover up that expansion joint around the perimeter. With this particular installation, if we wanted, we could install the floor right up to the baseboard and leave the expansion gap. In that case, we could put a quarter round around the perimeter in order to cover up the expansion gap. With this installation, we have decided we're going to remove the baseboards, and that way we will have the expansion gap underneath the baseboards. If you have a wall that is plaster and you are going to be doing a floating floor system, I would recommend maybe that you don't take the baseboards off because of the damage that could occur to the plaster, but instead go up against the baseboards and then install a quarter round. We have made the decision to cover up our expansion gap by removing the baseboards. In order to remove the baseboards, I would advise that you first use a knife and score across the top of the baseboard in order to cut the paint line. Next, before using your pry bar, I would suggest that you use a piece of 1/4 inch plywood onto the wall first so that you do not damage the wall. And as you move it along, it will allow you to remove the baseboard without actually damaging the wall. So now that our baseboards have been removed, all we have to do is simply sweep up the floor, install our underlayment, and we'll begin installing our trellis floor. Baseboards and quarter rounds are a very important consideration when installing your floating floor. Because you need an expansion gap around the perimeter of most floors, the quarter round, which you see here, is used to cover up the expansion gap around the perimeter, as well as the baseboard itself can cover up the expansion around the perimeter. By removing them and moving the floor in as close as you can to the wall, you will not require any new baseboards or quarter rounds when you've installed your floor. We've removed the baseboards, and the next recommended installation technique will be to undercut both the casings and the door jambs. A few tips in order to set the right height to cut off the baseboards and or the casings around the door would be to put your underlayment down and take the plank of flooring that you're going to be installing. Now, by turning it upside down, you won't damage the finish of the floor. So once in place, take your handsaw out now, and what we're going to do is we're basically going to cut right at exactly the right height. And you can see that we can remove the pieces that are underneath. So now when the floor goes underneath, you will not be able to see the expansion gap around the perimeter of the room. Okay. As you can see, I finished undercutting the casing on the front, and now I'm going to proceed to the side, and now we're going to undercut the door jamb itself. I may be done. Now that we've undercut the door, we just take the piece out, and you can see how thick it is. This will now give us room for expansion as well as room to cover up the joint. So when the floor is finally installed, you'll get a nice finished look. By undercutting both the jamb extension and the casing, this is the look that can be achieved. By not undercutting the door frame, there will be a gap between the door jamb and your flooring. After completing this side of the doorway using our hand tools, we're now going to proceed to the other side of the door, and this time we're going to be using some power tools. The same preparation has been done. You can see the baseboard has been removed. We're going to now undercut both the casing and the door jamb. In order to achieve this, we're going to be using an undercut saw. There's a number of undercut saws out there. Myself, I use this one here because it has an adjustable base. With the adjustable base, we can now move it in and out and set it for exactly the thickness of our flooring. And that way we'll achieve the best finished look around the perimeter of the door, as you'll have a nice clean undercut. In order to set the blade at the right height, we're going to put all of the components together. First of all, we have our underlayment that we're going to use, and next we're going to put the flooring on top. The combination of these two will be the height that we're going to set our saw at. So, by loosening the blade off, we can now set the saw at exactly the right height. Once the height is set, we will tighten down. And now, as you can see, we have the saw set at the right height. Since we're going to be working with power tools, safety is going to be of the utmost importance. I suggest before starting anything, make sure you get your safety glasses on first. Next, make sure you keep your hands away from the blade, and at all times keep the cords away from your working area. We have now completed demonstrating two different ways to undercut your door frames. One of them with the handsaw, the other one with a power saw, both of which will give a nice finished look to your floor.
Check for proper clearance under the door. You can do that measurement by laying down a piece of underlayment and a piece of your floor. To remove the baseboard, first use a knife to cut the paint line. Before using your pry bar, use a piece of plywood to prevent damaging your wall. If you have a plaster wall, you might damage it as you try to remove your baseboard. If you choose not to remove your baseboard, you can install your floor and then cover the gap with a quarter round. An expansion gap is required all around a floating floor. When installing under a door, by undercutting the casings in the door jambs, you will avoid ugly gaps between the floor and the door frame. You can use a handsaw or a power tool. Your measure for cutting will be the thickness of your underlayment and your floor. You will thus be able to fit your planks exactly under your door jamb and casing, which will give you a nice and clean finish.